Before we get into this video, for anyone that follows me on Instagram, you will know that apart from talking about racing, the thing that I love to do more is actually race myself. And recently I won a 24-hour kart race against other YouTubers like The Sidemen and Quadrant. I made a really epic video that I honestly think is the best piece of content that I have ever made, telling the story of the race. So if you're interested, then definitely go and check it out. I would really appreciate your support, and I'll leave a link to it at the very top of the description. With 8 races done, we are now a third of the way through the 2024 season, and I thought it would be a good time to look back at the best and worst drivers so far. Now, these videos are always really good to look back on at the end of the year when I do my top 5 best and my top 5 worst drivers of the whole season, because it's always interesting to see which drivers I thought were doing well or badly at the start of the year and how that compares to the latter half of the season. Nevertheless, I'm going to start off with my top 5 worst and then get into my top 5 best, so let's jump into it. First up, I have got Lance Stroll. Now, to be honest, this 5th spot was a bit of a toss-up between either Lance or Checo, especially after the last 3 races, which have seen Checo drop down to 5th in the championship. In the end, the reason I chose Lance is because, although he's definitely been more competitive up against Fernando than last year, he has still continued to have numerous crashes, as we have seen in Jeddah, China, and also Monaco. In terms of his stats compared to Fernando, although their race and quali head-to-head actually isn't too bad, the average qualifying gap is still one of the biggest on the grid, and most importantly, he still isn't scoring enough points relative to Fernando, having contributed just 25% of the team's total points. The fact that Fernando himself is also going through a bit of a rough patch over the last 3 races, I think makes Lance look like he's driving better than he actually is. In reality, even if Aston Martin was more competitive, Lance just isn't in that same caliber as the drivers that Aston Martin want for him to compete with. When it comes to Ricciardo, the biggest reason why he had to make this list can be summarized in one word: expectations. The narrative that I was hearing from fans and the media coming into the year was that Yuki was almost going to be a non-factor for Ricciardo at RB, and that his entire season was going to be about him getting into that Red Bull for 2025. Given that Red Bull have committed early to Checo by giving him a multi-year deal, it clearly shows that they discounted Ricciardo from that seat pretty early into the season, and the reason for that is because so far, Yuki has dominated Ricciardo. Daniel has only outqualified and finished ahead of Yuki once so far this year, and apart from scoring points during the sprint in Miami, which has been by far his best performance, in terms of the race where it really matters, Ricciardo still hasn't finished inside the top 10 to score points, whereas Yuki has already done so 5 times this season. Or when you compare expectations to reality, Ricciardo's season so far has been really disappointing, especially when you take into account that the RB is a pretty decent car. It's by far the best out of those bottom 5 teams, and as of late, they've even been outperforming the Aston Martin. With Lawson on the sidelines and Yuki doing what he's been doing, a driver of Ricciardo's pedigree really should be doing a lot better. And now, Zhou is definitely a driver who stands out on this list because the stats alone don't tell anywhere near the full story. For one, he is the only driver in this top 5 who is actually ahead of his teammate in the championship and yet somehow ends up on this list. Now, I do also want to say that I actually feel a little bit sorry for Zhou because not only has the Sauber been on average the worst car on the grid so far this season, but the team itself has also been an absolute mess on an operational side and hasn't put him in the best position possible to succeed. Having said that, although Zhou started the season really well, finishing in P11 in Bahrain, and was massively unlucky not to score even a single point, as nothing went wrong for any of the top 5 teams. Since then, he has been comprehensively outperformed by Valtteri, and the only time that he's beaten him, it's usually been because Valtteri has had a race-ruining 30-second pit stop. In the end, although he has been really unlucky with the car performance, he has also not shown enough development for a driver who is now in his 3rd season of Formula 1. And now, I have already made a whole video dedicated to Kevin Magnussen's season so far, and that was even before he got tangled up in yet more carnage at Monaco. What more is there to really say? He has been outperformed by Hülkenberg, he has not scored anywhere near enough points compared to what the Haas has been capable of, he has directly been involved in multiple crashes, most of which were his fault, and he's still 2 penalty points away from getting a race ban. Unlike Zhou, for example, K-Mag is a veteran of Formula 1. He made his debut over a decade ago, and it just feels like, although he deserved to make a comeback in 2022 and proved his worth at the time, when the biggest contribution that you can make to your team is not your performance, but your ability to be a roadblock for your teammate, I think that says everything you need to know about your value to your team. There's no doubt that Logan Sargeant has definitely improved over his rookie campaign, but at the same time that's not really saying that much. Albon is still dominating him in every department, and their average qualifying gap is the second largest on the grid. Even when you take into account him having to miss the Australian Grand Prix, when the team chose to give his chassis to Alex, which undoubtedly was very harsh and clearly a vote of no confidence from James Vowles, there's just not been enough glimpses of quality or even glimpses of potential for the future. Granted, the Williams hasn't been as competitive as it was last year, but even so, the team has openly admitted that it's looking at other drivers as potential replacements, and when the team principal puts that kind of information out into the media himself, it shows clear as day that the team feels that their driver has had enough time and that they're not contributing enough to the team. So now let's get into my top 5 best drivers so far, and first up I have Yuki Tsunoda. Now everything that I said about Daniel Ricciardo basically applies to Yuki, but in reverse. Coming into this season, I don't remember seeing anyone back Yuki to beat Ricciardo, and so the fact that he's actually dominating him so far and has scored almost 80% of the team's total points means that he warrants a place on this list. I also think it's worth noting that not only is Tsunoda the highest placed driver in the championship out of those bottom 5 teams, but he is also ahead of Stroll in the Aston Martin, which for the majority of this season has been the better car. Yuki has not only impressed in qualifying, but he's also been extremely consistent in the races, and he is also genuinely outperforming drivers in better cars. If you told someone at the start of the year that 8 races into the season, Ricciardo would be leading the midfield in the championship and would be dominating his teammate, people would be going crazy for him to be in that Red Bull. And so I think now that it's the other way around, you have to show that same level of appreciation to the driver that no one expected to perform as well as he has. There's no doubt that Lando's first career win is the most memorable part of his season so far, but I think for me what's impressed me the most is that he's continued to show that same level of almost championship level consistency that made him so great last year. His pole lap in the wet during the sprint shootout in China I think was absolutely sublime, and even though the McLaren actually started the season a little bit behind the Ferrari, I think Lando has done a fantastic job to limit the damage in the early part of the year. In terms of his head-to-head with Piastri, I think his points tally actually flatters him a little bit, and I don't say that to necessarily take credit away from Lando, but more to say that I think Oscar has been slightly unlucky at times this season, like with the timing of the safety car in Miami, and I think their average qualifying gap, which is the closest on the grid, is more indicative of how close and how competitive this driver lineup has been. Zach Brown has said on multiple occasions in the past that he believes he has the best driver lineup on the grid, and whether you agree with him or not, he definitely has a right to feel that way looking at how his drivers are performing. When it comes to Carlos Sainz, there's definitely a bit of context that I think is important to add to his season. Not only did he miss a race after needing surgery, hence the asterisk next to his percentage of points scored, but he also came into this season knowing that he was going to leave Ferrari, and that added an extra level of pressure on him because he is literally driving for his career. That is why it makes it all the more impressive that so far he has finished every single race in the top 5, and also immediately after having surgery won the Australian Grand Prix. That weekend in particular I think was one of his best ever because although he got lucky with Max retiring, he still outperformed Leclerc and qualified on the front row, and even if Max hadn't retired, he would have still finished in a very strong second place to cap off a great performance. Charles Leclerc is currently just 31 points behind Max Verstappen in the championship, and if you offered me that after the first couple of races, I would have bit your hand off. I mentioned earlier that Sainz has finished every single race in the top 5. Well, Leclerc is currently the only driver on the grid to finish every single race in the top 4, and that's despite a reliability issue with his brakes in Bahrain. As you can imagine, however, it's still been incredibly close between the two Ferrari teammates, which, as I have always said about the Ferrari, McLaren and Mercedes driver lineups, isn't a knock on any of their drivers, it's evidence for how good all of those driver lineups are. Over the past 3 or 4 races, it's genuinely felt like Ferrari and McLaren have made significant gains on Red Bull, and to me it's just brought out the best in Leclerc. Breaking the Monaco curse I think was really significant, and I think even though Ferrari still isn't consistent enough to challenge the Red Bull on every circuit, Leclerc to me has more than proved that he has the ability to go toe-to-toe with Max and challenge him for the championship if Ferrari can continue to win races consistently. Having said that, I think it's also important to not get too caught up in the moment and to not forget the greatness that Max continues to show. Monaco was the first race of the season that he didn't start on pole position, which in itself is crazy to think about, and whilst the dominant races are always impressive in their own right, I think Imola was one of his best ever weekends. That was a race where McLaren genuinely had the car to beat him, and not only did he produce a sensational qualifying lap, which albeit was aided a little bit by that Hülkenberg slipstream, but he also judged the tyre wear perfectly in the race, and it was Max Verstappen who made the difference and won Red Bull the race on a weekend where they were definitely vulnerable. Even though Max has started to just make a few more mistakes than usual as the other teams have gotten closer and put more pressure on him like we saw in qualifying in Monaco, he has still been undeniably the driver of the season. Although it's great to see Leclerc and Lando get closer to Max because we want to see more drivers and more teams in the fight for the win, make no mistake, Red Bull still remains the team to beat in this championship, and Max Verstappen is still the benchmark driver for everyone on the grid. Well, there you have it. Once again, don't forget to check out my previous video telling the story of my own Verstappen-esque racing exploits in a 24-hour endurance race. I'd really appreciate your support on that video, but also don't forget to let me know your top 5 best and worst drivers of the season so far as well. If you did enjoy this video and want to support the channel, then don't forget to subscribe, that would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.